Good morning and welcome all the participants in this webinar session. Today we have Ms. Hina Riyat from Sula Wine, very talented and charming lady who is just going to make the presentation on the basics of wines. Now I'm just going to hand over the screen to Ms. Hina, and Hina, please, it's all yours now.
Thank
Kindly
you,
take.
sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone who's joined this morning. I hope you're all well and safe in this quarantine. We thought we should cover this topic of wines because a lot of us have heard about wines, probably have seen them somewhere, but a lot of us are not very confident to approach wines. So I thought I'll cover the basics today. And in case you have any questions during the session, please feel free to ask me in the chat section and I will answer them towards the end of the session. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. I work with Sula Vineyards, and Sula is one of the largest winemakers. So about 80% of wine that is produced in India is produced by Sula. And we have our vineyards in Nasik, of course, in Dindori, which is a little further ahead from Nasik. And we also have our vineyards in Karnataka around Bangalore. So Sula's been around the block for a long time. This is our 20th year now. How the story goes is our founder, Rajiv Samant, was studying at Stanford, and I think the wine bug bit him. And when he came back to India, they had some 5 acres of land, which his father was contemplating whether to keep or to sell. And he said, okay, hold on, let's see what we can do with it. And if he had sold that 5 acres of land that day, we wouldn't have 3,000 acres that we have now. And we've come a long way from that. People were making wine before Sula in India as well, but they were not making single varietal wines. So if you've ever picked up a bottle of wine and read a Sauvignon Blanc on it or a Shiraz on it, so those are the names of the grapes, and the wine that's made from those grapes is called varietal wines, referring to the variety of the grape that is used. So Sula started that trend in India where we imported the rootstocks from overseas. We planted them in India in 1998 and we sold our first bottle in 2000. So it's been a great journey and I'm very happy to be a part of the company, and I'm even more honored to take this session for this esteemed university today. So let's start. My first question, obviously, if this was a live session and I could see you all, I would ask you what is wine, and I want you to ask that to yourself for a second and think about it. What is wine really? We know it is alcohol. It is an alcoholic beverage, but how is it different from the other beverages? How is it different from a beer? How is it different from a whiskey? And why should wine be priced as it is, and why should wine smell like it does? So we will cover all of those things in today's session. And before I go to that topic, I'm going to cover a little bit about the history of wine. So it's not that it's just got popular today, like 20, 30 years ago. Wine's been around the block for a really, really long amount of time. And most of us, when we think about wine, we think about France. And, due credit to France for keeping up the customs and the culture and the winemaking processes. But in fact, the oldest evidence of winemaking has been found in a place called Azerbaijan near Georgia. So if you see the tags on the map, France is really, really far from those 3 tags that you see on the screen. So historically, that's where the oldest evidence of winemaking has been found, even somewhere in China, in fact. And how it traveled was with the monks towards Rome. And the wines that we drink today come from one parent plant, mostly from one parent plant. And that parent plant has its origin in France, and it's called Vitis vinifera. That's why most people think that most wines come from France. Yeah, so that's a little bit about the history. In case you have any questions about this, you can always ask me. Coming to the wine making process. So wine is basically a fermented beverage that comes from grapes. Now, can I make it from any other fruit? Yes, I can, but I will need to mention it on the label what fruit I have used. So for example, if you go to Himachal, people are making wines out of pears and apples and, all different kinds of fruits. but they do mention on the label whether it's a pear wine, it's an apple wine. But when I say just wine, it has to be made from 100% grapes. So if you've ever smelled wine, you must have smelled an apple or a pineapple, all of those things in it. But in fact, none of those things are added in the wine. It is made from 100% grapes. Yeah. I will take you through the winemaking process. It's a very long process, but I'll take you through it in brief. So, of course, planting grapes is like any other agriculture. It's like planting any other fruit. Uh, Now is the mango season. If you've had an unripe mango or a raw mango, which we call kacham or keri, and when you taste it, it's very tart. There's no sugar, there's no sweetness in it. And as it ripens, the tartness starts to go down and the sugar starts to increase. Okay, so that is the most common live example for us to understand how fruits develop sugars. So similarly, when grapes are underripe or unripe, they are very tart. And as they start to ripen, they start to develop sugars. How are they going to ripen? They need a lot of heat for it. Yeah. So if you see grapes that come from really cold countries will tend to be less sweet. The grapes that come from really hot countries will tend to develop more sugar. Okay. So we test this by a process called sampling. So the winemakers and the viticulturists go into the vineyard, they pick the grapes, they sample them, they take them back to the lab and they check whether the grape has the right amount of sugar, it has the right amount of acidity, and whether it's ready to make the wine. So that process is called sampling. And once I've sampled my grape and I've ascertained, okay, this is the right amount of ripeness that I want, I go on to harvest those grapes. So in India, the harvest starts around late December, goes on up to February end. I think by March, all of the harvest is done. So thankfully, when COVID hit us this year, I think we were able to salvage all our crops. Most of the wineries were able to salvage all of the crops, and we were able to make wine from each and every grape. So that's a good thing that happens, that the harvest is during the winters. After the harvest, depending on what kind of wine I want to make. So most of us, if we haven't had wine before, we've at least seen wine. So you would have seen three primary colors, especially the ones available in India, that is either red or white or rosé for the wines. So that makes us think, okay, well, there's a red wine and there's a white wine. So there have to be two colored grapes. There has to be a red grape. Some people also call it black grape, which is correct. Sometimes the color is really dark. So both of them are correct. And there is the white grape, which some people call green grape. Even if you call it green grape, that's perfectly fine. So there's red grape and white grape. And you can make a red wine out of it, you can make a white wine out of it, and you can also make a rosé wine out of it. I will tell you the process in a bit. But depending on what kind of wine I want to make, I will either crush the grapes or I will press the grapes. So when I press the grapes, I'm slightly pressing them to squeeze out the juice. When I'm crushing them, I'm using all of the skins, the juice, the seeds, and the resultant is called the must, grape must. Okay. So based on what I have, grape must or grape juice, I will start my fermentation process. So fermentation is, we experience fermentation on an everyday basis. If you've seen your mother make yogurt, that is a very, very common process of fermentation. Bread baking is a process of fermentation. Okay. So fermentation is a process in which the yeasts eat up the sugar and they convert it into alcohol and carbon dioxide and other compounds. Okay. So for wine, alcohol and carbon dioxide are very, very important for us. These two things and the usage of these two things will tell us what style of wine we are going to make. Yeah. So fermentation is done by adding yeast. A lot of people ask me what strain of yeast is used. Now, yeast is also a living being. We use a specific strain, which is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Why? Is because this is the strain which has been found to survive in such an alcoholic environment. If you put any other yeast or most other yeast would die in such an alcoholic environment. So we use a specific strain of yeast to make wine. the fermentation process starts. So, for example, I want to blend two grapes and make a Cabernet Shiraz by blending a Cabernet Sauvignon and a Shiraz. So that will happen after the fermentation process, where I have my resultant wine. I will test in different proportions, and then I'll say, okay, this is the right proportion of the wine that I want to put in my bottle. So that process is called blending. After blending, the wine goes for stabilization. So stabilization is basically the process of cooling down the wine to remove any crystals, impurities, tartrates, all of those things. So after stabilization, I can choose to age my wine. Now, a lot of us use that phrase, you age like fine wine. And but usually we think that wine is always aged. We forget that we said you age like fine wine. So there are only certain kinds of wines which are supposed to be aged. Um, Before bottling is absolutely the decision of the winemaker, but after bottling, if you have the bottle, most wines are supposed to be consumed very young so that they retain their fresh aroma. So not all wine needs to be aged, but again, depending on the grape and the decision of the winemaker, aging happens at the winery. It can happen in an oak barrel. Now, oak barrel, it's like a vessel which is made from oak tree, the wood from an oak tree. Mostly the oak barrels come from either America or France, and likewise they are called American oak barrels or French oak barrels. There's a slight difference in the process in which they are made. There's a slight difference in the costs of them. There's a difference in the kind of flavors they impart to the wine. So depending on what kind of barrel I want to use, I can choose that vessel. I can choose to age my wine even in the bottle. Now, like I said in the beginning, how is it different from a whiskey? Because in this whole chart, if you see, you will not see me distilling the wine anywhere. And most of us associate alcohol with distillation. But in fact, wine is an undistilled beverage. It is just a fermented beverage. So I ferment it, I filter it, I can age it or not age it, and I choose to put it in the bottle and serve it to you. Yeah. So when I do that, when I don't distill it, I'm actually conserving a lot of the natural components of the wine, which are eventually going to interact with each other. Okay. So which is why your wine will also age in the bottle. It will change flavor day by day, month by month, year by year. Yes. After aging, I can choose to filter the wine. I will filter the wine, and then it goes for bottling and dispatch. And then, of course, consumption if you're the right age. So that's a little bit about the winemaking process. I kept it very, very brief. Now, I said it is, how is it different from the whiskey? Is because it's not distilled. But one wine is also different from the other wine. I gave an example of mangoes in the beginning, but even when you go to buy mangoes, you see 10 varieties of mangoes, and they're all mangoes at the end of the day, but they all smell a little different, taste a little different. Similarly, there are grape varieties, and they are all different from one another. There are thousands and thousands of them. They vary from region to region, depending on the kind of soil we have, the kind of climate we have. So they come from different regions. So in India, there are only certain grape varieties that we can plant, which can survive in this kind of environment. So one wine will differ from the other, but the science behind it remains the same. At the end of the day, it's taking the sugar, fermenting it, converting it into alcohol. Okay? So even within the region, if I say in India, I have 49 wineries, how would my Sauvignon Blanc be different from the next winery's Sauvignon Blanc, right? That's where the winemaker comes in, and it's sort of an art for them, how they treat their grapes, where they choose to age it, how long the fermentation would be. All of those things are in the hands of the winemaker, and he's sort of the artist of the wine. So if you see on the screen, I've put two definitions of how science defines wine, which is a very, very technical definition. It is an alcoholic beverage. It's made from the fermentation of grapes until and unless specified otherwise, where I've used another fruit. So how art defines it is it is a reflection of terroir of the place where the fruit was grown and a literal reflection of history in a drop. Now, you would have seen that people talk about vintages of wine, and I'm going to show you. So, luckily, I have one bottle of wine left during this pandemic. So, if you see, there's a year written here, right? So it says 2018, and when I said it's a literal drop of history in a bottle, this 2018 tells you what was the weather that year, what was the condition of the grapes that year, what was the quality of the grapes that year, and it's all put inside this bottle. If my crop is not nice, no matter what I do to the wine, I cannot make a good wine out of it. So it really, really depends on the kind of basic produce that I have. And what does that depend on? The vintage, the year, the conditions in that year. Yeah. So if I read 2018 on this bottle, I'm literally looking back at 2018 and reflecting on what the conditions were in Nasik under which this wine was produced. Yeah, so that's how art defines it. But what is actually in your bottle or your glass of wine? I already told you that it is made from grapes. Okay, it gets converted to alcohol. All right, there is carbon dioxide that is produced with it. All right, so I have a vague idea of what all of those things are, but all of those things don't constitute the 750 ml in my bottle. If you go to a restaurant, once you start working in a restaurant, the standard pour of wine is usually 150 ml in a glass. But is all of my 150 ml alcohol? No. So if you see on the screen, I've kind of picked apart the components of your wine. So even on this bottle, it says 13.5%. So only 13.5% of this whole 750 ml is alcohol. So what is the rest? So 70% of it is water. Then of course you have alcohol, and there is sugar. Like I said, to ripen, the grapes develop sugar. So there's always some sugar. Most of that sugar gets converted to alcohol. If all of that sugar is not converted to alcohol, there will be some sugar left over in the wine, and that's the sweetness that you taste. Okay, it's called residual sugar. Wine tastes a little tart, so of course there are acids. Wine smells like a lot of things which are not grapes, so there are aroma compounds which give the wines their specific aromas or tastes. So these are the components of wine. Wine is an acidic beverage. Okay? This is something that we also need to remember. So this is a scale that I saw somewhere online, and I actually found it quite interesting because when I meet consumers who are having wine for the first time, they sip it and they go like, "Oh, it's too tart," right? So the tartness is something that actually preserves the wine. So acids are good for the wine. Acids are refreshing for your palate. Acids are good for aging of the wine. So acidity in a wine is actually a good thing. Once you train your palate to get accustomed to that acidity, I think it starts seeming more pleasant to you. So for comparison's sake, people say wine is acidic. I have put together things that we have on an everyday basis, which are even more acidic than a wine. So Coke. Coke is something that we have, so often. But why don't we think that Coke is so acidic? Uh, Coke's acidity on the pH scale is 2.5 to 2.6, whereas wine would be 3.5 to 3.1. So the further we go towards the red, the lower the pH, the more acidic the beverage. Even coffee is an acidic beverage. Now I'll do a comparison of Coke and wine when we come to talking about serving temperatures, and you will actually realize why don't you taste the acidity in a Coke as you do in a wine. Yeah. So we spoke about the contents of uh, the bottle. How do we taste them? How do we perceive them? There is something called, when we taste wines, we actually don't gulp them. It's a systematic tasting of wines just to analyze the wine. So if I have a Viognier with me, I will taste it just to assess, okay, this is a Viognier. Is this what I expect from a Viognier? and then you eventually assess whether it's a good quality Viognier or a bad quality Viognier. Is it justified? Is it worth the price? So most of you, if you're studying at the university, you will probably, go on to become a manager or a general manager at a hotel or a restaurant. Once you become responsible for picking the wines for your menu, that's when all of these things will come in handy, and you will actually carefully need to analyze each and every wine before you put it on your menu. Yeah. So what are we looking for when we taste wine? So of course it has alcohol, but how do we taste alcohol? I mean, if you have to think about how does alcohol taste, right? You can't really pick a word. Is it bitter? Is it sweet? Is it? But you can pick a perception. How does alcohol feel? When you have alcohol, it produces heat in your throat. If you have, say, something in a whiskey, which is 40%, it's going to feel very, very hot. But in wine, which ranges between 8 to 15.5%, it is going to be less hot as compared to whiskey. But an 8% wine and a 15% wine is still going to have a lot of difference in that alcohol perception. Yeah. So how you perceive alcohol with the kind of heat that it produces here. Then the acidity. Now, acidity, of course, we relate with sourness or tartness, right? But again, I'm coming with a but and an example. If you have something more acidic, so your wine is acidic, but you're having a salad with a vinegar dressing, so your wine is going to feel less acidic because you're already having something which is more sour. Yeah. So how do you actually then determine the acidity of wine? Your mouth will start to water. Again, the perception of mouth watering is the tell of acidity. Yeah. Sugar, of course, sugar is, the sweetness that you taste on your palate. And then there is something called tannins. Tannins is something you will hear very, very often once you start working at a hotel or a restaurant and you're talking about wines. So tannins are something which give wine body, which give wine structure, which give wine color. Now, when we were looking at the fermentation process, I said we will either crush or press the grapes. When we crush the grapes, which is usually in the case of red wines, the skins also get crushed. And we eventually end up using the skins of the wines as well. Why? Because although there are two colors of grapes, red and white, the color is only in the skin of the red grape. The pulp and the juice is actually white. If I remove the skin of the red grape, I can actually also make a white wine out of it, which is quite interesting. So tannins come from that skin. So tannins will give the wine color. They will give your wine a slight hint of bitterness and the feeling of dryness around your gums and your mouth. If you've had jamun in your life, it's the same feeling as eating jamun. If you've had black tea, cold black tea, then it's the same feeling, because both of those things have tannins, both of those things have bitterness, both of those things have color. Yeah, so the tannins give all of these things the bitterness, color, and the dryness in your mouth. So these are the things that we are looking for. All of these things will give the wine its body. And we will talk about different kinds of wines. Now I said they come from red and white grapes, alcohol and carbon dioxide. So based on what we are using, there are different types of wines. So if you see this bottle, there's no bubbles in it, right? So it's simply still. So during the fermentation, if I let that carbon dioxide go and I only use the alcohol, I get something called a still wine. Okay, still simply meaning there's no movement inside. It's a still wine. It can be a red wine, it can be a white wine, it can be a rosé wine. Okay, so now red and white, I already told you how it is made. Rosé is an actually French word for pink. So it's a pink colored wine with different hues, salmon, peach, different hues. How is it made is you have the skin of the red grapes and you have the juice. So once you leave the skin on the juice, the color starts to drain in the juice. Now, the winemaker goes and checks every hour and sees how much color has been drained. When he thinks it's the right amount of color, he removes the skin, and the resultant is a light pink colored wine, which we call a rosé wine. Now, same process, if I chose to leave those skins for say 10 days or 20 days, a lot of color would have been extracted. So then I make a red wine out of it. So same process, less skin contact would be a rosé, a lot of skin contact would be a red wine. Yeah. So still wines come in red, white, and rosé. Now there was that carbon dioxide, and if I say, okay, let me use that carbon dioxide and put it in my bottle, then I get something called a sparkling wine. We need to be very, very careful while calling it champagne. Not all sparkling wines are champagne. I'm sure most of you are aware of it, but sometimes out of habit or, unconsciously, we just call any sparkling wine a champagne. But champagne is in fact a region in France, and unless your sparkling wine comes from that region, you cannot call it champagne. In other cases, unless it comes from a protected region, it is called a sparkling wine. Sparkle is nothing but carbon dioxide bubbles trapped inside your bottle. Now, I have two kinds of wines. Even sparkling will be red, white, and rosé again. So I have still and sparkling. Now with still wine, I say, okay, I only got like 15% of alcohol, but I need more alcohol in my wine, right? But there's no sugar left in my wine to get converted to alcohol. So how will I make a wine with more alcohol? I can choose to add a neutral spirit. The only condition is that spirit has to be made from grapes. A lot of people choose to add brandy or any spirit that is made from grapes to take the alcohol level of the still wine up. That is called a fortified wine. Sometimes people stop fermentation midway so that they have a sweet wine and add alcohol later on. So they get a sweeter fortified wine out of it. If you've ever heard of port wine, if you've ever heard of sherry, so those are examples of fortified wine. Now I say, okay, well, I might need another kind of wine, which is more aromatic. So I choose to add herbs and botanicals in it, and I get an aromatized wine. The most common example of aromatized wine that you will probably see and use in the bar is vermouth. If you've ever heard of the name martini, not martini the cocktail, but martini the vermouth. So that is also an example of aromatized wine. Yeah. So these are the different types of wine. But now I said I have acids in it, I have sugar in it. So if I'm a customer and I want a less sweet or a more sweet wine, how do I express myself? I can't just say still wine. Still wine can have more sugar, can have less sugar, right? So how do I express myself on the basis of how sweet my wine is? Okay. So there are different categories for it. If it is very little to no sweetness in your wine, it is called a dry wine. So let's not confuse this dryness with the feeling of dryness in our mouth. A dry wine will not make your mouth dry. It is simply an expression used to describe a wine which has very little sugar. Okay, so very little sugar, dry wine, a little more sugar, off dry, a little more sugar, medium sweet, and a lot of sugar is a sweet wine. So you must think, why would I have 4 categories for a little variance in sugar? But in fact, the variance is a lot. The sweet wines, which is the extreme category, you would see them in the dessert wine section of your menu. Dry wine would have less than 7 grams per liter of sugar, and a sweet wine would have 100 to 120 grams per liter of sugar. So just for comparison's sake and for you to understand what that gram would mean, a cup of coffee that we usually have is about 150, 130 ml. And the sugar sachet that we usually add is about 5 grams. Okay. So that 5 grams makes the 150 ml just about sweet enough. So I'm talking about those 5 grams in 1 liter. Sometimes it's even 1 gram. Okay, so that's almost no sugar that you can taste in your wine. Whereas in a sweet wine, think sugar syrup, that level of sweetness. Think maple syrup, think honey. So 100 to 120 grams per liter of sugar or more sometimes. So that's how I would express myself based on the sweetness, right? Then comes the body. Now, I'm not trying to complicate it, but I'm just trying to lay out the terms for you that you would see thrown around very, very often and what they actually mean, so that you can kind of have a point of reference. I said your wine has sugar. I said your wine has alcohol. I said your wine can have tannins. Okay. So all of these things, when I put in my wine, naturally they will make my wine thick. Okay. So a thick wine will have a full body. So body is nothing but the thickness of the liquid inside the bottle. Okay. So if it is very, very light, I call it light body, medium body, full body. And if it is full body, that means, I can actually think, does it have more alcohol? Does it have more sugar? Are both of the things high? Does it have more tannins? Okay, so it actually tells you something about the wine. And then it helps you pick the food that you're going to have with it. So light, the rule that we usually learn is light wines with light meat and red wines with red meat. Okay, but what about the vegetarians? We don't think about the vegetarians. So in reality, the practical rule is light wine, and I don't mean the color, a light bodied wine, a light flavored wine with light food, so that one doesn't overpower the other, and bold wine with bold food. So if I'm having, say, a dal makhni, it's very buttery, creamy, rich in protein, very heavy. I will need something to stand up to it. If I give you a very, very light wine, it may just feel very, very flat. Okay, so body comes in when you think about wine and food pairing as well. I hope you have, a little bit of an idea of how we can categorize wine into different categories. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to ask. One of the last topics that I want to cover, I don't want to cover too much today, just going through the basics, is decoding the wine label. The other thing that you will come across once you start to work is sometimes you see a bottle of wine and you're not able to understand what it is. You would think, oh, I studied a Chardonnay in my course and I studied a Sauvignon Blanc, but this does not seem like any of that. And that usually happens because that wine has come from old world. Now, like I said, wine's been around for a really, really long period of time. So there are countries that have been growing grapes and making wine for such a long time that they now have laws governing each plot where the grapes are grown. Okay, so the laws are very stringent. They tell you the amount of irrigation that's required, the kind of grapes that are required, the harvest season, the picking, everything is actually defined by laws. Okay. The primary difference that you will see and why you were not able to understand that label is because a new world wine will not tell you the name of the grape, unlike an old world wine will not tell you the name of the grape, unlike a new world wine. So if you see on your screen, I've put an old world wine next to a new world wine, simply for you to observe the label. Okay. If you see on the left, this wine is from Bouchard. It is from France, and it says Chablis. Now you might think, what is Chablis? What is this grape? Have I heard of it? You would try to recall, but in fact, it is the name of the region. So what has happened is, so suppose I take an example of whichever area you are in. Okay, so I take the example of K.R. Mangalam University. Suppose you have X plot of land, okay, and you start producing wine, and you keep producing wine for 100 years, 150 years, X number of years. And you said, when you started that vineyard, you said, I will plant Chardonnay in this plot called K.R. Mangalam University. Okay. So when you kept planting Chardonnay for 100 years, 150 years, you reach that point where you don't even need to write Chardonnay anymore. You write K.R. Mangalam University, and I am referring to the plot of land, and people understand, okay, this plot only produces Chardonnay. Okay, so you don't even need to write the name of the grape. When you refer to the region, people automatically understand because that's what you've been producing. That's what's approved for that area. Okay, so that's how this trend has come in. So Chablis is a small village above Burgundy in France, and if you think about Chablis, you think Chardonnay, and they are known to produce very clean, lean styles of Chardonnay. Yeah. As opposed to the New World, when you look at the second bottle, it says Trapiche Ocas Malbec. So you already see on the label that it is a Malbec. You know about Malbec. So even when you're picking the wine, you're serving it to someone, you're recommending it to someone, you already know what to expect. Okay, that is because New World is a more recent wine growing region, and they've just been growing wine for the last 1,500 years or so, and they're experimenting a lot. There are a lot of Shiraz grown next to Pioneer or vice versa. A lot of experiments going on. So they mention the name of the grape on the label as opposed to the region. The region may be mentioned, but the name of the grape is definitely mentioned. Yeah, so that's the difference in packaging in the new world and the old world. Now, serving and storing of wine, again, is very important. Um, I will correlate it to what I mentioned earlier. When you've had Coke, but it has not seemed very tart to you. That's because most of us have our Coke chilled. And if you have Coke at home, you can actually experiment. When you leave Coke out for some time and the fizz goes out, the Coke starts to feel very flat and it will start to feel very, very sweet. Okay, because Coke has a lot of sugar, and what's balancing it is the amount of fizz it has and the amount of acidity it has. So think about wine. When you chill it to the right temperature, the acidity and the sugar is going to feel balanced. If you have it warm, it's either going to feel very sweet or it's going to feel very tart. So the most common example, like I said, is having a Coke at room temperature or having a lemonade at room temperature. One is going to feel very, very sweet and one is going to feel very, very tart. Yeah. That's why there are different temperatures for service of wine. Very sweet wines and very acidic wines, let's put them at the first extreme, which is extremely chilled. So serve them at 6 to 8 degrees. In this heat, I would even recommend, start at 5 degrees. So 5 to 8 degrees for extremely sweet and extremely acidic wines. So as the acidity starts to get low, the temperature starts to go up. And for red wines, the room temperature rule does not apply today in Gurgaon, where I am. It's about 43 degrees outside, and that's about the temperature of my room without air conditioning. So if I put my bottle outside, it is going to be as hot or comparatively hot. And what happens when you have hot wine, apart from it feeling too sweet or too acidic and very flat, is that your alcohol starts evaporating very, very fast. And when you actually, people do this whole experiment of swirling their wine and smelling the wine, the first thing that they're going to smell is alcohol, because that's the first thing that's evaporating and not the pleasant aromas. Yes, it's important to even chill your red wines. Even if it is a very bold red wine, still make sure that you've chilled it to about 18, 19 degrees, because by the time you open it, you serve it, it sits in the person's glass and they have it, it is going to come to room temperature anyway. Yeah, so good idea to even chill your red wines. When you're not serving the wines and this is in your backup storage somewhere, again, it cannot be a very hot place. Wines don't like heat, they don't like a lot of light, they don't like too much movement. So a quiet, dark place, temperature not more than 15 degrees, and preferably a little bit of humidity, especially if your wines have corks. Okay. Now, if you see this wine, this is produced by Sula. It has a screw cap, primarily because there's so much heat in this country. And if your wine with a cork is not stored like this, the wine does not touch the cork gets dry, it gets shrinked, and the air goes in, your wine gets spoiled. But with a screw cap, there's no such risk. You can store it horizontal, vertical, any way, it does not get spoiled. So, especially if your wines have cork, they need to be stored horizontally and in a humid environment. So that's about storing and service of wine. And I think I've pretty much covered all of the topics that I wanted to go through today. And I'm happy to take questions now. Okay. How does effervescence occur in sparkling wines? Okay. So effervescence is just, like I said, it's a more complicated word for carbon dioxide. Now, because you've asked is, and I'm very interested in science. So a lot of us think that it is a carbon dioxide bubble. Okay. Now, what is happening is when there is this wine, carbon dioxide is inside it. I've sealed it. There's no place for carbon dioxide to go out, right? So it gets dissolved in the wine. When I open it, the pressure outside is lower than the pressure inside the bottle. So carbon dioxide rushes out into the atmosphere and it leaves vacuum inside the wine. And those vacuum trapped inside the wine form bubbles. Okay, so bubble is not something that has gas in it. It's actually the gas that has escaped and left some space. I think I had a lot of fun answering these questions. Very geeky. Yeah, but I hope that answers your question. Okay, very effective knowledge. Any Q&A? Why do people say that older wine is better? Like I said, all wines don't need to be aged, but yes, some wines, especially wines that are produced at very expensive houses in Bordeaux or certain regions which are mostly the old world. New world is also experimenting with aging their wine. If it's a very fine wine and it has been mentioned by the winemaker saying that this wine will peak at 5 years or 10 years, or you need to have it after that amount of time, only then should you age your wine, which is why you buy it and you put it in your cellar and you forget about it and have it after 10 years. But a lot of wines don't need to be aged. And Francis Robinson says about 90% of the wine that is produced in the world does not need to be aged. The winemaker has produced it with an intent for you to be able to enjoy that fresh, fruity, floral aroma. I told you that it is undistilled. There is a lot happening in the bottle. So when it gets old, the flavor changes. If it's smelling like fresh fruit today, it's probably going to smell like dried fruit or cooked fruit tomorrow. Okay. So if you want to enjoy the fresh flavors, fresh aromas, most wines should be had young. But always refer to the website of the winery, the winemaker, and follow their instructions. Effervescence, I've already answered. How much time is taken to make a red wine? Okay. Depends on the winemaker. So anywhere between a couple of weeks to 24 months to years. Really depends, because it depends on how long the skins were left on for, based on how much color the winemaker wants, right? How long did the fermentation go on for? Fermentation can go on for 10 days to 1 month to, some wines being fermented for years. So it really depends on the winemaker. But yeah, I'd say about a month, a minimum for the wine. How much do you add flavorings to wine to achieve different aromas? No, wine is made from 100% grapes. The only thing that is added to wine is sulfur dioxide, which is, a sort of a preservative. It is approved by the government. Most wineries, about 95% wineries across the world, add sulfur dioxide as a preservative. So if you read on the label, it would say contains sulfur. Yeah. The quantity is again approved by the government. So most things that you have which are out of a packet, fries, sometimes even nuts, contain sulfur as a preservative. So that is the only thing that is added to the wine. No other thing is added apart from yeast to carry out the fermentation. The aromas that you get are actually the natural aroma compounds present in the grapes getting converted during the process of fermentation into other aroma compounds. If you really want to do some research about it, because I can't go very technical, you should look up esterification or esters, ESTERS. Just look it up on Google and you'll understand how aroma compounds work. Yeah, I'm happy to answer any other questions. Okay, how wine cork plays an important role as most of wines do not have. Okay, interesting question. So, you know, hundreds of years ago, when there was no way to close wines, people used to put a rag, I think usually dipped in oil or something, to close the wines because they didn't have any other enclosures. Then came corks because people understood that corks swell up very fast. So corks have been earlier, they were just used as, because they didn't have screw caps, just a method of enclosure. But eventually they started getting associated to the wine being premium. But that's really not the case. Some, wineries want to use a cork, some wineries want to use a screw cap. If you see a lot of new world wineries, including Australia, New Zealand, they use a screw cap. So it's really a preference. It helps preserve your wine, especially if you know that your wine is going to be exported and it's going to travel long distances, and you don't know in what conditions it's going to be on the ships for a really long amount of time, and you don't know whether it's going to be stored like this. So a screw cap is going to be a safer bet. It is slightly more economical, but there are winemakers who want to age their wines and they want a little bit of breathability from their stopper. So they choose to use a cork. Really depends. What is the future of nanotechnology in the wine industry? Well, I think it's great. In fact, barring the situation that we are in COVID right now, I think the wine industry is coming up with so many opportunities, and not just nanotechnology. If you are studying any scientific field which deals with, even if it's microbiology, you can study viticulture, you can study so many things. A lot of people who are even studying agriculture, for example, can go on and get trained in viticulture and work in that field. So yeah, great future. I think you should definitely look up opportunities to work at wineries. The lab plays a very important role in winemaking because all of the testing of the components of wine, whether you have the right amount of ratios of everything, happens in lab. So sure, go for it. And because you've asked me this question, I would like to emphasize on careers in winemaking and alcobev industry in general, because when I do these sessions at universities and colleges, a lot of people think that, uh, you know, working in a hotel or a restaurant is eventually the career path that you can take after hospitality. And I'm sure you've been briefed by the very able team that have counseled you on your careers. But I think it's my duty to encourage more and more people to join the alcohol industry. And you don't really need to be, uh, it does not mean that you have to be sitting there drinking wine or whiskey just because you work in the industry. You can be an educator like me. You can be an event manager. You can, be a brand ambassador. And these fields actually focus more on the marketing and the educational aspect of the alcohol industry. So you can actually go on and study WSET, which is the Wine and Spirit Education Trust. It is a body based out of London, UK. And we have centers across India and partners across India that teach WSET. There are 4 levels, level 1, 2, 3, and the diploma in WSET, followed by a master's in wine. And if you want to look at the educational aspect of it, please go ahead and look up WSET online and do your research. You can study it. It's not very expensive to do the first 2 levels, and it certainly helps you even if you're not in the alcohol industry and you work at a hotel, but you have your basic wine knowledge. Maybe you can start your career path towards being a sommelier. Yeah, so WSET is a great option. Sula also teaches WSET. We are a WSET partner at a very affordable price, the details of which I can share with your management. And if you don't want to go into the education aspect of it, but you want to work at a hotel as a sommelier, then you can look at something called CMS, which is Court of Master Sommeliers. Unfortunately, the higher levels of CMS are not taught in India, but there is the beginner level, so you can actually start with that. And then there is the Wine Scholar Guild, in which you can do wine diplomas in specific countries. So you can be a French wine scholar or you can be an Italian wine scholar. And it is not just about wines. You can study sake, you can study whiskey, you can study beers, you can study vodka, and there's diplomas and there's degrees for everything. And I spoke about masters of wine. There's only one woman who's a master of wine in the country, and across the world, there are just about 300 people who have studied masters in wine. So just imagine the scope that is there for you to study. So definitely think about this as a career option. Any specific site to study updates for wine and industry growth in regards wine? There's a lot of Instagram pages you can follow, and I'm forgetting the name. I will definitely share it with your with Professor Verma. There is a bunch of sites that you can follow, but if you're a beginner and you're looking for something really fun, there is someone who runs a website called Wine Folly. I'm sure you've kind of followed it. You can start by following them on their Instagram page. It's a really fun and interactive way of learning wines, and they don't make it look too complicated. You know, it registers in your head slowly. So maybe look that up. And there are other professional websites as well, and I will share a list of those with Professor Verma. Please name the Master of Wines in India. There's just one, Sonal Holland. She's the only Master of Wine in India. There are a lot of people who have done diploma, but again, I don't think would be more than 15, 20. I could be wrong, but those are the ones that I know. And again, once you've done your diploma in wines, most of those people are either running their own wine education institutes or wine businesses or wine consulting firms, or they are wine educators. You know, you can teach WSET as a diploma holder. So yeah, that's going to be great. Have you ever heard about orange wines or skin contact wines? Yes, of course. The reason why I didn't cover orange wines is because one, it is not available in India today. So you're not really going to see any orange wines. And two, they are still gaining popularity, although they are the oldest forms of wine. So earlier what people used to do was take grapes, put them in a pot, bury them in the ground and just leave them, forget about it for 6 months, open it. So eventually, because there was no sophisticated process of making wine, they had to have skin contact, and they were doing that even for white grapes. So when you do that with white grapes, the wine that comes out of it is not really white, pristine, but it has an orange tint to it, and that's why it's called orange wine. Like I said, they are the oldest forms of wine, but they're gaining popularity now. Hopefully, they'll be available in India soon as well. Okay, I think I don't have any more questions. If there's any more questions, please feel free to ping me. And Professor Verma, thank you so much for having me. If there's anything else you'd like me to cover, I'm happy to do that.
Thank you, Hina. I think you have covered everything so well and very detailed. I must say our presenter is more alcoholic than wine. That's one compliment I can give you. And I'm Professor MP Verma. I'm a Dean of Hotel Management at KR Mangalam University, Gurgaon. I thank you all the participants, and thank you, Hina, you also and your company. Thank you so much being with us. And we will look forward more session like this in future also.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you. Take care. Stay safe. Stay well. Bye-bye.